Samson's story does not begin with a man. It begins with a world where freedom had become a memory. Ancient Israel at this time was not a unified kingdom, not a centralized state, and not an empire, but a loose collection of small tribal communities, scattered villages, farms, hill settlements, and valleys, where daily life revolved around survival rather than ambition. People lived close to the land, dependent on harvests, vulnerable to drought, raids, and instability, and every generation learned that staying alive mattered more than dreaming of dominance. In this environment, power did not simply mean strength. It meant access to weapons, access to trade routes, access to fortified shelter. And this access was something Israel rarely controlled. The dominant presence across the region belonged to the Philistines, a coastal civilization that was not only militarily strong but technologically advanced. While many surrounding groups were still transitioning from bronze tools to iron, the Philistines had already mastered iron production, integrating it into warfare and economy. Iron weapons were stronger, sharper, more durable, and easier to reproduce, giving them a decisive advantage over fragmented tribal societies. This advantage did not remain confined to the battlefield. It spread into daily life. Philistine dominance functioned as a system. Fortified city-states formed the backbone of their control. Organized armies ensured rapid response, supply networks sustained long campaigns, and surrounding regions felt the pressure of this structure. For the Israelites, this meant restricted access to weapons, monitored movement, and swift punishment for resistance. Over time, this kind of control reshapes psychology. When a population grows up knowing it cannot fight back, resistance stops feeling heroic and starts feeling reckless. Courage is replaced by caution. Unity gives way to fragmentation, and survival becomes the highest value. This is the world into which Samson is born, not as a prince or political leader, but as a sign. According to tradition, his birth is announced before it occurs, a narrative signal that this individual is not meant to emerge through ordinary social processes. He is not chosen by councils, not trained by elders, not elevated by success. His purpose is assigned before his identity forms. And with that purpose come constraints. A vow that shapes not only his strength, but his entire sense of self. This vow defines what he can eat, how he lives, how he appears, marking him as different from the beginning. Difference can create strength, but it also creates isolation. Samson grows up apart. His power does not develop through training or discipline. It appears suddenly, violently, without warning or structure. No institution shapes him. No hierarchy teaches restraint. No community prepares him for responsibility. Because of this, Samson does not become a leader. He becomes a disruption. He does not organize people. He does not build alliances. He reacts to moments, strikes hard, and moves on. This makes him terrifying to his enemies and confusing to his own people. His actions weaken Philistine confidence, but fail to produce lasting change, because disruption without structure cannot build freedom. Samson crosses boundaries easily, entering Philistine territory without fear, interacting with enemies casually, forming relationships that blur cultural and spiritual lines. These choices are not accidents. They reflect an inner conflict. Samson carries immense power but lacks internal discipline. His strength has no long-term vision, no restraint, no guiding framework. This imbalance defines his life. Every act of violence cracks Philistine control, but every impulse deepens Samson's isolation. Israel benefits indirectly from his actions, but cannot rally behind him. The Philistines fear him, but also begin to study him, recognizing patterns in his behavior, his impulsiveness, his trust, his emotional openness. Samson stands as a living contradiction, chosen yet uncontrolled, powerful yet unformed. A man carrying extraordinary force in a society that needs organized freedom. And this unresolved tension sets the stage for everything that follows. Because a man with power, but without system, can shake an empire, but he cannot replace it. As Samson moved from youth into adulthood, his strength began to express itself not through purpose, but through reaction. His actions were not guided by a long-term vision of liberation, but by immediate emotion. Encounters and personal grievance, conflict followed him rather than being planned by him. And this distinction is critical to understanding why Samson never became a nation builder. His earliest acts of violence were sudden and overwhelming, tearing apart enemies, breaking gates, destroying property, acts that demonstrated raw power but also revealed a lack of restraint. These moments shocked the Philistines because they defied expectation, and unsettled the Israelites because they lacked direction. Samson did not behave like a judge who gathered tribes or coordinated resistance. He acted alone, and while his victories were dramatic, they were unstable. Every strike weakened Philistine confidence, but failed to establish lasting freedom. Because Samson did not replace control with structure, he replaced it with disruption. One of the most revealing patterns in his life was his repeated movement into Philistine territory. Instead of defending borders or organizing protection, he crossed boundaries freely, showing fearlessness but also recklessness. This behavior sent a psychological message to the Philistines that their control was not absolute. But it also sent a message to his own people that resistance was unpredictable and personal rather than collective. Samson's relationships followed the same pattern as his battles, driven by desire rather than wisdom. He formed attachments across cultural and spiritual lines, ignoring boundaries that existed not merely as traditions, but as safeguards. These choices were not simply moral failures. They reflected loneliness, isolation, and a lack of belonging. Samson lived between worlds, too powerful to be ordinary, too uncontrolled to be trusted as a leader. His strength separated him from peers, while his vow separated him from normal social life, leaving impulse as his primary guide. This combination created a cycle: provocation, reaction, escalation, and withdrawal. Each time Samson struck, he escalated tension. Each time tension escalated, retaliation increased. And each time retaliation increased, his isolation deepened. The Philistines began to recognize this cycle. They observed that Samson's power did not grow from discipline, but from emotion, anger, attraction, pride, and wounded ego. This made him strong in the moment, but vulnerable over time. Because predictable impulses can be studied and unstructured power can be redirected. Israelite society watched Samson with mixed feelings. He represented hope, but not safety, strength, but not stability. They benefited from the cracks he created. In Philistine dominance, but they could not organize around him because he did not offer a plan. He did not offer unity. He did not offer continuity. Samson's story at this stage reveals a deeper truth about power. Strength alone does not liberate. It must be shaped into something repeatable, teachable, and transferable. Samson's power could not be passed on. It could not be shared. It could not be institutionalized. It lived and died within him, and this made him extraordinary, but also terminal. The Philistines feared him, but also began to adapt, understanding that direct confrontation failed, but patience might succeed. While Samson remained unaware that his greatest threat was no longer soldiers or weapons, but access, trust, and emotional exposure. This period of his life marks the turning point, where raw force begins to meet calculated observation, where impulse begins to meet strategy, and where a man who could tear down walls unknowingly begins to walk toward a trap built not of stone or iron, but of intimacy and persuasion, setting the stage for a conflict that strength alone would not resolve. The Philistines eventually accepted a reality that brute force could not change. Samson could not be defeated through soldiers, weapons, or walls. Every attempt to confront him directly ended in loss, humiliation, or fear, so they shifted their thinking from strength to access, from battlefield tactics to psychological strategy, understanding that power which cannot be broken must be entered. This shift marks one of the most important transitions in the story because it reveals intelligence rather than desperation. The Philistines stopped asking how to kill Samson and began asking how to reach him. They observed his patterns closely, his movements, his emotional triggers, his relationships, and they noticed a consistent vulnerability. Samson trusted intimacy more than strategy. He relaxed his vigilance when desire replaced caution. And where force failed, familiarity succeeded. This realization led them to Delilah, not as a romantic figure, but as a calculated point of entry. Delilah's role was not to overpower Samson, but to remain near him long enough to dissolve his defenses. Her power was patience, not aggression, repetition, not threat. She asked the same question again and again, not with urgency, but with persistence, slowly transforming suspicion into routine. This is how psychological pressure works. It does not attack, it normalizes. Samson initially treated the danger lightly, responding with lies, jokes, and half-truths, believing his strength placed him beyond consequence. Each false answer increased his confidence and reduced his caution. Because survival had always followed strength, and strength had never failed him before. But this confidence blinded him to the real shift taking place. The battlefield was no longer physical. It was emotional. Every repeated question weakened the boundary between secrecy and trust, between vigilance and comfort. And over time, the questions stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like intimacy. This is the moment where power begins to collapse inward, not because it is taken, but because it is surrendered. Samson did not lose his secret through force. He gave it through familiarity. When the truth finally emerged, it did not feel dangerous to him. It felt personal. But personal truth is the most exploitable form of knowledge, because it is given freely and guarded poorly. When his hair was cut, the loss was not symbolic superstition. It was the physical expression of a broken vow. The structure that framed his power collapsed, discipline dissolved, and strength departed. Not gradually, but decisively. For the first time, Samson experienced weakness not as fatigue, but as absence. And the Philistines struck immediately, not with chaos, but with efficiency, capturing him without struggle, blinding him to remove both threat and identity, and reducing him to controlled labor. This was not simply punishment, it was transformation. The strongest man of his age was turned into an object, a warning, a display of dominance. Blindness served a purpose beyond cruelty. It removed direction, autonomy, and agency, making dependence unavoidable. The Philistines understood that power must be humiliated to be neutralized, and humiliation works best when it is repetitive and public. Samson was placed into routine, grinding grain day after day, stripped of movement, choice, and silence. His world reduced to darkness and rhythm. This stage of the story is critical because it shows the complete inversion of Samson's life. A man once defined by sudden action was now trapped in slow repetition. A man who lived by impulse was forced into stillness. And in that stillness, something unexpected began to occur. Awareness replaced reaction, reflection replaced movement. And for the first time, Samson confronted the gap between who he was meant to be and how he had lived. The Philistines believed they had ended the threat, but what they had actually done was remove noise, and when noise disappears, meaning begins to surface. Samson's power had always been loud, reactive, and external. Now power became internal, quiet, and deliberate. Hair slowly grew back, but more importantly, intention returned. Strength was no longer treated as a personal weapon, but as responsibility. The Philistines could measure muscle and blindness, but they could not measure resolve, and this miscalculation would define their final mistake. Because domination that focuses only on control often forgets that identity reshapes itself under pressure, and when identity changes, power changes with it, setting the stage for a conclusion that would not be decided by force or escape, but by choice. After Samson's capture, the Philistines did not rush toward execution or spectacle. Instead, they chose a slower, more effective method of domination: captivity. Because captivity is not designed to end a life, it is designed to reshape it. Samson was blinded not only to remove his threat, but to erase his orientation in the world. Sight had allowed movement, choice, and independence. Blindness removed all three, making him dependent on routine and instruction. This was a calculated act, not emotional revenge. The Philistines understood that a man defined by sudden motion must be neutralized through stillness, and a man defined by autonomy must be broken through dependence. Samson was placed into repetitive labor, grinding grain day after day, a task chosen not for efficiency, but for symbolism. The strongest man of his age reduced to the most basic form of work, stripped of agency and dignity. This repetition was meant to empty him, to turn extraordinary strength into meaningless motion. Yet repetition has a dual nature. When used for control, it also creates space for reflection. Removed from battle noise, distraction, and desire, Samson entered a state he had never experienced before. Enforced silence, without sight, without choice, without urgency, time slowed. And in that slowness, awareness began to form. This stage represents the psychological center of the entire narrative. Because for the first time, Samson's power was not activated outward, but examined inward. His past actions replayed not as victories, but as patterns, impulse after impulse, reaction after reaction, each moment of strength followed by isolation. Captivity forced him to confront the truth that his power had never been guided. It had been indulged, and indulgence had led him here. Blindness also served as a removal of identity markers. Samson had always been known for what he could do physically. Once that was gone, his sense of self collapsed, and collapse created vulnerability. But vulnerability also created clarity. This is where Samson's transformation truly begins. Not when hair grows back, but when intention returns. Strength begins to take a different form. No longer explosive and immediate, but controlled and internal. Patience replaces impulse. Waiting replaces reaction. The Philistines interpreted Samson's quiet as defeat. But silence does not always indicate emptiness. Sometimes it indicates compression. Identity under pressure does not disappear. It reorganizes. And this reorganization is invisible to those who only measure power in physical terms. The Philistines continued to display Samson publicly, bringing him out as proof of dominance. Entertainment for crowds, reinforcing the narrative that strength had been conquered. But public humiliation often strengthens resolve rather than erasing it. Each display reminded Samson not of his weakness, but of his purpose, not of his loss, but of what domination looked like when it believed itself complete. The Philistines celebrated because they believed the story was over. But the absence of resistance created complacency, and complacency is the final weakness of any dominant system. While Samson was no longer free to move, he was free to think, and thought reshaped intention. His power had once been uncontrolled force. Now it was deliberate meaning. Captivity did what victory never had. It taught him restraint, and restraint turned strength into choice. This period completes the internal transformation that makes the final act possible. Because the ending of Samson's story is not about escaping captivity or reclaiming status. It is about deciding how power should be used when nothing remains. To protect, this psychological reformation sets the stage for the final confrontation, where domination will be challenged not through survival, but through sacrifice, and where Samson's role will be completed not as a warrior seeking triumph, but as a figure choosing meaning over life. The final phase of Samson's story unfolds not in secrecy or isolation, but in public spectacle, because domination always seeks an audience. The Philistines gathered for celebration not merely to honor victory, but to confirm it. The great temple became the stage where power displayed itself. Rulers, priests, soldiers, and citizens assembled to witness proof that resistance had been crushed. Samson was brought forward not as a threat, but as an exhibit, a living symbol that even the most Uncontrollable force could be reduced to obedience. This moment is critical because it reveals how power understands itself. Domination believes it is strongest when it is visible, when enemies are humiliated publicly, and when fear is converted into entertainment. The Philistines believed they were closing the narrative, transforming Samson from legend into lesson, but spectacle often blinds those who rely on it. The temple itself carried meaning beyond architecture. Supported by massive pillars, it represented order, structure, and permanence, everything Samson had lacked internally. The Philistines placed him at the center of this structure, believing proximity to order would neutralize chaos. Yet they misunderstood the nature of transformation that had occurred during captivity. Samson was no longer the reactive figure driven by impulse. He had spent months in silence, repetition, and reflection compresses intention. When he was positioned between the pillars, he was not searching for escape or survival. He was measuring consequence. This distinction separates revenge from resolution. Samson's request to be guided toward the pillars was not a moment of weakness, but of clarity. Blindness did not make him unaware. It sharpened focus by removing distraction. He could no longer see crowds' faces or guards. He could only feel structure, weight, and balance. Power now existed as calculation rather than eruption. The Philistines assumed that humiliation had emptied Samson of will. But humiliation does not erase meaning, it concentrates it. The laughter of the crowd reinforced a belief that domination was complete, and completeness creates carelessness. No one questioned why Samson was brought so close to the core of the structure. No one imagined that a man stripped of sight and freedom could still choose. This is where domination fails repeatedly throughout history. It assumes that control over bodies equals control over intention, but intention is internal. Shaped by meaning, not force, Samson's final moment was not impulsive, it was deliberate. His strength returned not as uncontrolled rage, but as directed action. When he pushed against the pillars, he was not acting out of personal revenge alone. He was collapsing the illusion that power is permanent. The destruction of the temple was not merely physical, it was symbolic. The center of Philistine confidence was exposed as vulnerable. The structure that represented order fell because it relied on the assumption that chaos had been neutralized. This collapse reveals a deep truth about power systems. Domination often depends on the belief that resistance has ended. When that belief becomes certainty, vigilance disappears. Samson's act did not free Israel immediately. It did not establish governance or peace, but it shattered psychological dominance. It replaced fear with awareness, showing that even the most controlled systems carry internal fragility. Samson's death within the collapse is essential to understanding the act. He did not survive. Because survival was not the objective, he chose meaning over continuation, sacrifice over escape. This transforms the act from revenge into statement. Power can end domination, but it cannot coexist with self-preservation when no structure exists. To carry it forward, Samson completed his role not as a ruler, but as a rupture, a moment where imbalance corrects itself through collapse. The Philistines lost more than lives and stone. They lost certainty, and certainty is the foundation of control. The crowd that gathered to witness humiliation instead witnessed vulnerability. The spectacle designed to affirm power exposed its limits. And Samson's story reached its turning point not in victory or defeat, but in revelation, revealing that domination is strongest when unquestioned, and weakest when it believes itself absolute. This moment reframes the entire narrative, transforming Samson from a reckless disruptor into a deliberate agent of collapse. Not because he mastered power, but because he finally understood its cost. And this understanding prepares the ground for the final interpretation of his legacy, where his life will be judged not by what he built, but by what he revealed about strength, responsibility, and the fragile nature of control. Samson's death cannot be understood as a simple act of revenge or despair, because revenge seeks continuation and despair seeks escape. While Samson chose neither, he chose finality with intention. And this distinction transforms the meaning of his life. Throughout his stories, Samson never pursued survival as a goal. He pursued reaction, impulse, and release, but in the final moment, survival disappears from the equation entirely. This is not because he no longer valued life, but because life without purpose had already been stripped from him during captivity. When a man loses identity, survival becomes instinct rather than meaning, and instinct alone cannot guide a final decision. Samson's choice reveals that power without structure eventually reaches a point where it can no longer coexist with self-preservation because there is no system left to carry it forward. He was not a king who could pass authority, not a prophet who could pass teaching, not a general who could pass command. His power lived entirely within his body. And once that body became the final instrument, the outcome was inevitable. This is why Samson could not walk away from the temple. Survival would have returned him to a world where his power once again lacked direction. Repetition would begin again, impulse would return, and collapse would simply be delayed. Sacrifice was not an emotional act. It was a structural one. It ended a cycle that could not resolve itself otherwise. The Philistines misread this moment completely. They believed Samson was acting from humiliation or rage. Because domination always assumes that resistance is emotional rather than intentional. But Samson's stillness before action signals the opposite. His decision was compressed over time in silence, not sparked by insult. Captivity did not break him. It clarified him, and clarity produces decisions that appear extreme to those who lack context. Samson's death communicates something that survival never could. That domination can be disrupted even when structure is absent. But it cannot be replaced without discipline. This is why Samson's story ends in collapse rather than transition. No new order rises immediately because Samson was never meant to build one. His role was to reveal imbalance, not to resolve it permanently. This is what separates Samson from later figures who establish systems. His life functions as a warning. Embedded in narrative, strength without discipline will always turn inward or outward destructively. The temple collapse is not victory, because victory implies continuation. Instead, it is interruption. It halts certainty, destabilizes belief, and creates space for change without defining its direction. This ambiguity is essential because meaning without ambiguity becomes instruction. And Samson's story is not instruction, it is reflection. His death forces both Israel and the Philistines to confront limits. Israel sees that raw power alone cannot deliver freedom. And the Philistines see that control built on certainty carries hidden fragility. The message is not that sacrifice is ideal, but that some forms of power exhaust themselves if not guided. Samson's blindness plays a critical symbolic role here. Because blindness removes illusion, sight allows us to believe we understand the world. Blindness forces us to feel structure rather than appearance. Samson's final act comes from touch, balance, and pressure, not vision, meaning it is grounded in reality rather than perception. The Philistines relied on spectacle, sight, and display. Samson relied on contact, weight, and alignment. This contrast reflects two philosophies of power, one external and one internal. And when internal resolve meets, external complacency collapse becomes possible. Samson's story, therefore, does not glorify death. It interrogates it, asking why some individuals are pushed to endpoints rather than integrated into systems. His inability to survive his own purpose reveals the cost of neglecting discipline. In the presence of power, and this cost is not personal alone, it is societal. Communities that elevate strength without shaping it produce disruption, not liberation. Samson's final moment stands as the consequence of collective failure as much as individual flaw. No one taught him restraint. No one built structure around him. No one transformed his power into something transferable. And so his power ended where it began, within himself. The collapse of the temple closes one chapter, but opens a larger question that echoes beyond the narrative. What does society do with individuals who carry extraordinary force but lack framework? Do they worship them, fear them, exploit them, or abandon them? Samson's life answers indirectly. Untreated power always ends in loss, either of control or of life. And while his sacrifice disrupts domination, it also leaves behind a silence filled with unresolved responsibility, preparing the ground for the final interpretation of his legacy, where Samson is remembered not for how he lived or died, but for what his story exposes about power, discipline, identity, and the human cost of imbalance. Samson's legacy has never been simple, because simple stories create heroes, while complex stories create mirrors, and Samson belongs to the second kind. He is remembered across generations, not because he built a nation or ruled a people, but because his life exposes the cost of power that exists without discipline, guidance, and structure. Some traditions celebrate him as a deliverer who weakened Philistine control. Others see him as a tragic figure undone by his own impulses. But both readings miss the deeper meaning. Samson was not designed to succeed in the conventional sense. His role was to reveal imbalance, to show what happens when extraordinary force is introduced into a society that lacks the systems to shape it. His life becomes a study in responsibility shared between individual and community. Samson was chosen but not trained, empowered but not guided, celebrated but not integrated. And these failures were not his alone. They belonged to the society that elevated strength without building structure around it. Israel benefited from Samson's disruptions, but never transformed them into organized freedom. The Philistines feared Samson's strength, but underestimated his capacity for meaning. Both sides reduced him to a function rather than understanding him as a human being, carrying an impossible burden. This reduction explains why his story ends in sacrifice rather than continuity. Because sacrifice often emerges where integration fails. Samson could not become a king because kings require systems, advisors, and continuity. He could not become a prophet because prophets require discipline and restraint. He remained something in between, a living rupture. His blindness becomes the most enduring symbol of his story. Because blindness stripped away illusion and forced confrontation with reality. When Samson could see, he reacted. When he could not see, he reflected, and reflection reshaped intention. This reversal challenges common assumptions about power, suggesting that clarity does not always come from vision, but from limitation. Samson's final act is remembered not because of its violence, but because of its decisiveness. It shows that some forms of power cannot be redeemed through reform. They must be ended to prevent repetition. This does not glorify destruction. It contextualizes it. The temple collapse stands as a warning to dominant systems that believe control is permanent, and to resistant forces that believe strength alone is enough. Domination fails when it becomes complacent. Resistance fails when it lacks discipline. Samson's life occupies the space between these failures, making his story enduring across cultures and eras. Because every age produces individuals of extraordinary ability, physical, intellectual, or charismatic, and every age must decide how to shape them. When societies celebrate talent without responsibility, they produce instability. When they suppress talent without guidance, they produce resentment. Samson's story argues for a third path. Structure around power, discipline alongside strength, and accountability equal to ability. His death does not solve the problem he exposes, it amplifies it, leaving future generations to ask harder questions about leadership, preparation, and collective responsibility. Samson is therefore not a role model to be copied, but a narrative tool to be examined. His life warns that unchecked impulse destroys both enemies and self, that gifts demand boundaries, and that calling without preparation becomes tragedy. The reason Samson endures in memory is not because of his feats, but because of his failure to live beyond them. Failure in this sense is not moral condemnation, but structural outcome. A man cannot carry what a society refuses to support, and a society cannot rely on individuals it refuses to shape. Samson's story closes not with triumph or despair, but with insight. Insight that power is neutral until guided, that strength amplifies intention whether good or destructive, and that meaning emerges not from dominance or survival, but from alignment between ability and responsibility. In this way, Samson's life continues to speak long after the temple fell, long after the Philistines faded from history, because the conditions that created him, imbalance, fear, admiration, without discipline, continue to exist wherever power is unleashed without wisdom. And this enduring relevance is what transforms Samson from a figure of ancient narrative into a timeless reflection on the human relationship with power, restraint, and the cost of ignoring balance.